Okay, good morning, level 3s. On this page here, this is the Moodle page for Unit 9, and if you go into this particular folder here, Leeds Lessons, you can see that I've uploaded this template here, Assignment 2. So if you open up Assignment 2, all of the titles are in place and everything that you need to know about the assignment is there. So add your name in, the titles are there for you, and you've got all of the criteria which is laid out. So you've got P5, you've got P6, M3 and D3. And again, in red, everything is showing you this is what you need to do in order to achieve this criteria and to get this section. But I would advise you that although this template is out, and it does have a bit of help and guidance under each of the sections, make sure that you do it at the pace that we go at each week. So for this week, I'm only expecting you to start on P5, and you are certainly not going to be completing all of P5 in this week, because the unit criteria, there is a lot of it that we need to get through, and we're only going to go through 3 mini sections today, which I hope all of you can finish by Friday. And then next week we'll touch on a little bit more on P5, a little bit more the week after, and then towards the end of the term, then we'll move on to P6, M3, D3. Okay. Okay, so what we need to know about are the different types of research designs. And we're going to be looking at 3 different research designs in this part. So the first one is going to be cross-sectional studies. Okay, so a cross-sectional design. So with these types of designs are more observational and they're more descriptive. So we talked about these a couple of terms ago where we looked at qualitative analysis, where it's more about sort of opinions and observations. This is all about measuring a single point in time. So for a cross-sectional study, you might look at something that is happening right now in, let's say, Worthing. Generally speaking, these are very large scale, so you're not going to be looking at say like 20 people. You might be looking at 50, 100, or sometimes even in the thousands, which we do see quite a lot. And this is more about the populations that we're looking at. So last term when we looked at external validity, this is more about who that we're looking at. So it might be a specific demographic. You might look at a particular age, a particular race, a specific sort of specific ethnicity, and so on. So they will look at age groups, they'll look at races, or they can even look at geographical locations. So a study might be looking at teenagers in Worthing, or the elderly in Brighton. And it will also look at maybe the differences between males and females and how they react to specific ways of behaving. So in terms of methods of data collection, they can include things like mailed surveys, emailed surveys, or any other forms of widespread communication. So it might be things through text messages that you get. It might be through Facebook. Basically, as a researcher, you're going to need to try and get in touch with well over 100 participants in order to find information. So it might be something you do via WhatsApp, Facebook, or Snapchat, anything like that. And they're created to give you a snapshot of a specific population group. So you're not going to be able to test every single white British female between 16 and 18, but if you grab a fairly big handful, you can then sort of conclude that, well, at least this is a snapshot of, let's say, all white females from 16 to 18. So what we can look at in terms of examples is you might look at physical activity and resting heart rate. You might look at fizzy drink consumption and the effects of obesity. So you might look at specific populations, look at a specific variable such as fizzy drinks and obesity, and then can you conclude that from these specific populations. But in order to make it a little bit easier for you to understand, what I'm going to look at here is an example of millennials, so this would be you guys, and depression. So basically, how many millennials are depressed? We're going to look at this study in Worthing. So what we want to know is how many millennials are depressed in Worthing. So in terms of creating this study, or this cross-sectional study, we're going to look at 50 participants, and from this 50 participants, we might have given them emails, text messages, whatever it may be, and we concluded that 42% came out as depressed or sad or had some kind of anxiety going on. Therefore, as a researcher, you can conclude that 42% of all of Worthing's millennials are depressed. So this is something you need to look out for, because you see this a lot in newspapers. You see this cropping up on social media quite a lot, where you see these strange numbers and figures floating around that 60% of this many people are currently in this situation, when what they're doing is they're only doing a cross-sectional study, so they're just taking a very small representative group. So in our case, 50 millennials from Worthing, and because of this number, 42%, this is how we say, officially, quote unquote, 42% of all kids in Worthing are depressed, which isn't necessarily the case. So the next one is a longitudinal study, and this is very similar. So it's an observational descriptive study that involves repeated observations of the same variable. So rather than cross-sectional, looking at a single point in time, this one is going to be repeated. So you're going to be almost looking at these people or checking up on them on regular intervals. So again, used over a long period of time. This could be years, months, years, possibly even decades. So rather than looking at specific population groups, it's going to be looking at this individual, and we're going to follow this individual and track this individual for the next, let's say, 5-10 years, in terms of how certain things affect him. So it's looking at specific individuals, tracks the same people for a number of years, typically those that share similar characteristics. So it might be looking at people that were born in a specific estate, and maybe how they grow up, and maybe the different types of social interactions they have, things like nature versus nurture. So in terms of creating these studies, it can be very, very expensive and time consuming, and very similar to the last one, it's collected via telephone, email, post, other forms of communication, and quite a lot of these researchers will do this face to face. They might just do a knock on the door, sit with you, ask a few questions, collect some data, and then off they go. They'll come back in another couple of years or next year. So as I mentioned just briefly there, it could be things like nature versus nurture. Are you destined to be the way you are, or does your environment change the way you grow up and behave? So this is when they might look at a specific population group and then follow those people for the next 15-20 years in terms of how they've actually succeeded in their life. You can look at smoking and the cause of cardiovascular diseases, or maybe eating red meat, whether that affects potential of cancer. So again, by following these people for a very long period of time, you could find out that, let's say, out of 1,000 people, a large percentage of those people ended up getting cardiovascular diseases or cancers. But from that data, you might find out, well, actually, a lot of these people that got cardiovascular diseases were actually smokers, and this is where you start to make these conclusions. So with these longitudinal studies, you've got 3 different types that they fall into. So you've got panel studies, cohort studies, and retrospective studies. So with a panel study, this is when they start to follow households. So they'll look at particular families or environments, and they'll follow those environments for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years in terms of their development, behaviour, and so on and so on. With the cohort studies, this is where they looked at different groups that share the same characteristics. So again, people that are born in the same area. So for example, millennials, you're all born between this year and another year, so they might decide to follow these 30 individuals because they share the same birthday or the same period of time, but they're all grown up in different areas. And what they might do is they might conclude, oh well, yes, you're all millennials, but this particular person was grown up in this estate, you grew up in this area, and this is where they start to make conclusions. Finally, the next one is retrospective studies, where they might look at a specific area within like medicine. So they might look at things like cardiovascular diseases, they might look at the uses of medication, maybe the use of fast food and the effects of, a specific condition that might be happening. And this is where we get these big claims that, should we be eating red meat, and does red meat actually cause cancer? And I spoke about this in class where there was a study that did come out back in 2011, I think it was, or 2010, about how red meat does cause cancer, and it can be very fatal. However, they were checking up on these people once every 3 years, asking them questions about their diet, which wasn't really conclusive evidence, and a lot of people were consuming a lot of fast food. So the conclusions were red meat caused cancer. However, when we look at it, it was a little bit debunked because it was more processed meats like McDonald's, hot dogs, those kind of things. And the last one is something that we're probably a little bit more familiar with, which are experimental studies. So experimental studies are the ones that look at cause and effect, and they look to isolate specific variables to find answers to specific questions. So with, I would say, most experimental studies, they generally use control groups to make sure that the results they get are indeed valid. So this is where we've got these sort of examples here. You've got a control group and an experimental group. So what we want to find out is music a distraction, or is it an enhancement to learning or studying during exams? So you might put one control group with no music, one experimental group with music, and then you compare the results. How do they come out? So they're pre and post effects. They look at short and long-term effects of specific variables, and in some cases we can use placebo groups as well in order to strengthen the test conditions. These tests are generally controlled in experiments to make sure that they are in fact valid. So we can do these, something like we've done before. We've done them in classrooms, but generally speaking, most of the time they will be done in a lab to make sure we get consistency of results. So some things that we have looked at is, does resistance training improve throwing speed? So we could have a control group, and we can have an experimental group, one that is doing resistance training and looking at throwing speed, and another group that is not doing resistance training and looking at throwing speed, and which groups improved. And what you might find is that, well, both groups did improve, but the ones that did resistance training and bench pressing, pull-ups, wherever it may be, they actually improved their throwing speed a lot more than that of the control group. Therefore, you can conclude, yes, it does work. And again, really sort of popular ones, does caffeine improve reaction times? So again, you can give one group a cup of water or a cup of sugar, and you can give another group caffeine tablets or dissolved caffeine in a shot glass, and then test the results in 30 minutes time and look at the different reaction times there. So these are the sort of things that we've looked at in the class, in terms of one group does something, the other group doesn't. Again, before and after results, that you've probably seen loads of these kind of things on Instagram at the moment, in terms of, let's say, HIIT training or weight training, what's better for fat loss. And then you've got loads of people that will do HIIT training and show their after results, weight training that will show after results, or a combination of HIIT and weight training. And this is the whole point of doing experimental research, is that you don't just go in blind and sort of look at assumptions. This is something that you're going to be testing, or you'd look at secondary research on Google Scholar and find, actually, yes, this is the best method of training. So when we did those lessons where we looked at evidence-based practice, and as a PT or as a coach, what are you going to do with your clients to make sure you get the best results? Well, this is how we know, and this is how we find out. We do that research, we find out, so that everything you do is evidence-based rather than just you, I suppose, being told by your teacher. You go out and find the research yourself. So, with all those three things there, with the cross-sectional, the longitudinal, and the experimental, these are the only things that you are going to be talking about in this section here. So go into detail, explain what they are, and give examples of research that will fit that design. Okay, any problems, ask or email.